Hello and welcome back to ThoughtBat. In today's video we shall be discussing the ethical framework of utilitarianism and, more importantly, why I don't subscribe to it. Utilitarianism is an ethical and political philosophy which emerged in the 18th century, which owes inspiration to ancient hedonistic philosophers such as Epicurus and Aristippus, who concluded that happiness or pleasure produced by an action was the ethical measure of that action. Utilitarianism, as its own distinguished philosophy, begins with the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham, and was later expanded upon by his most famous student, John Stuart Mill, although very similar ideas to those within utilitarianism can be found within other philosophers such as John Gray, Francis Hutcheson, and most notably David Hume. The philosophy's foundational texts include Bentham's book, An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, and John Stuart Mill's essay simply titled Utilitarianism. So utilitarianism gets its name from its core foundation, the principle of utility. In the words of Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism, the principle of utility is that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever according to a tendency that appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question, or, what is the same thing in other words, to promote or oppose that happiness. So translating into modern English, Bentham is saying here that the principle of utility is a principle that determines an action to be moral or immoral, depending on whether it has increased or decreased happiness amongst a given affected party. There are certainly many different types of utilitarian, all differing on the interpretation of the principle of utility, but most utilitarians would agree that an action ought to be directed at maximising net utility amongst an effective group. But what is utility? Well, in economics, utility can be described as a measure of satisfaction one experiences from a certain activity or state of the world. Thankfully, Bentham again offers a definition. He says it's that property in any object whereby it tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good or happiness, or to prevent the happening of mischief, pain, evil or unhappiness. So with this in mind, we can deduce that utility is referring to value judgments made about given experiences. And since value implies a valuer, utility is necessarily subjective, it is mind dependent. On this point, we're led to the first problem within utilitarianism. In order for one to act as a good utilitarian, they must direct their actions to maximise net utility and amongst an affected group. But one must know how to do this. Aside from the problems of predicting the consequences of actions or deciding a cut-off point in consideration for a chain of events in consequence of an action, there would need to be a way to measure the individual degrees of utility experienced by a set of individuals affected by the action, and then calculate an aggregate utility for the population. In order to attain an aggregate utility, we need to have a cardinal measurement of utility, i.e. we need to be able to give the degrees of utility experienced by an individual a number. A unit of measuring utility is often referred to as the util. However, extracting cardinal data on utility is not possible, as satisfaction is necessarily a private experience. It is impossible to communicate the exact degree to which one is satisfied or dissatisfied by a given experience. For example, if you stub your toe, you can only communicate that this hurts or this really hurts. What you cannot do is put a number on how much it hurts, state how many negative utils a stubbing of your toe has brought you, and then expect everyone else to know the exact amount of pain you're experiencing. The reason for this is a given person may experience the same stimuli differently to other persons. It may be the case that you and I could stub our toes on the same object, at the same angle, at the same force, but I experience a resultant pain much more intensely than you do. This means that if I give stubbing my toe on this object with this amount of force, -1 util, -1 util of pain will be referring to a different degree of pain experienced by me than what it means to you. Therefore, we cannot have a universally understood or fixed unit of utility the same way we can have something such as length. Length is not necessarily a private observation. I can show you a ruler, point to the uniformly spaced lines on its edge, and say that this is what I'm calling a centimetre. Therefore, we can both understand the bathtub I've just stubbed my toe on is 50 centimetres tall. It would be misleading on me to continue the video as though Bentham did not propose a method of measuring the value of the pleasure or pain amongst a considered party. This is known as a hedonic calculus. In Chapter 4 of An Introduction to the Principle of Morals and Legislation, Bentham goes through a list of factors to be considered when determining the value of a pleasure or a pain. The list includes its intensity, its duration, its certainty, its propinquity or remoteness, which is how soon the sensation will be experienced, its fecundity, the ability to reproduce the experience of the same kind, its purity, its lack of producing effects of the opposite kind. To determine the value of pain or pleasure amongst a given group, these 6 properties are considered, as well as a 7th, its extent, which is the number of people who are affected by the given pleasure or pain. The means by which Bentham intends us to estimate the net utility of an act or legislation can be summarised as identifying immediate resultant pleasures or pains and taking account of each of the listed properties in order to, quote, sum up all the values of all the pleasures on the one side and all those on all the pains on the other. The balance, if it be on the side of pleasure, will give the good tendency of the act on the whole. If it be on the side of pain, the bad tendency of it upon the whole. And then to take into account of the number of persons affected and to repeat the process in order to find a balance amongst an affected population. Although we can be grateful to Bentham for shedding light on how the utilitarian thinks net utility can be determined, we still have a calculation problem on our hands. Firstly, while certain properties of a given pleasure or pain can be determined objectively, such as duration, certainty, fecundity, propinquity, and its extent, 2 important factors, intensity and purity, are necessarily private understandings, and so we're stuck yet again with a lack of universally understood measurements to bung into a hedonic calculus. Secondly, Bentham actually offers no formula for which properties of a pain or a pleasure are to be used to calculate a final value. This is as great of a problem as a physics teacher only telling his students that velocity is to be calculated according to the distance an object is travelled and the time taken to travel it, without telling his students what is to be done with these values to determine the resultant velocity. Such a formula, however, would be impossible, as the value for each property relative to the other would also be subjective. I mean, who would Bentham be to tell you that you or I should prefer a more intense yet shorter lasting pleasure than a less potent but more lingering one? Without each and every considered property being universally intelligible, and without the possibility of establishing a formula to make use of the values of each property to finally determine utility, at the end of the day, the hedonic calculus remains a useless, subjective and non-determinate means of calculating net utility. Without a fixed unit of utility, there is no way we can calculate net utility. The severity of this problem cannot be understated for anyone who values truth. This means that any solution to any given dispute must necessarily be arbitrary, as there is no method of verification for any hypothesis made about your net utility maximization. How could we possibly determine whether or not my suffering outweighs the happiness you derive from torturing me, and thus produce a lower net utility opposed to the situation where you didn't? The alternative then is to make use of something called intuition, or gut feelings, or common sense, or whatever, to decide whether an action will maximize net utility or not. You may compare 2 experiences by imagining yourself in the situation of those who are affected by an action, especially if you have experienced their situation before. For example, you want to compare the pain experienced by someone stubbing their toe and someone burning their hand on a stove. If you are unfortunate enough to have experienced both, you can derive an answer for yourself. You decide that burning your hand hurt more than stubbing your toe, so you intuit that a given person experiences more disutility if they burn their hand than the person who stubs their toe. Going forward, you may create an ordinal hierarchy of preferred experiences based on your own reactions to those experiences. But we must remember that this is your own value hierarchy and nobody else's. When comparing your ranked order with other people's hierarchies of preferred experiences, we can expect to have variation, even if there are trends such as ranking being hit in the face lower than watching TV. Given the strong potential for variation, these ordinal rankings may give no indication as to what combinations of outcomes lead to a maximum net utility, especially in reference to disputes where, when solved, one person suffers and the other profits. Therefore, without a clear means of quantifying net utility, utilitarianism is subject to being warped to fit the intuitions of a given arguer, which in turn allows utilitarians to feel morally comfortable advocating for any action, so long as they intuit that maximization of utility is the consequence. Intuition is by no means a truth maker, nor is it any demonstration of truth. As I said earlier, it's just a gut feeling. As shown in the sciences, where unintuitive conclusions about the universe are discovered all the time. For example, the discovery that the Earth is round and that the Earth orbits a sun, and not vice versa. Falling back on intuition is especially convenient for a utilitarian when confronted with reductios where utility maximisation seems to lead to the approval of egregious actions. There are a number of reductio ad absurdum arguments which could be thrown the utilitarian's way. Bear in mind, though, that reductio ad absurdum never leads to the proof of falsehood. It only shows that the applications of an ethical framework may lead to the consequences that a good number of people feel are undesirable. These reductios only become relevant if we resort to intuition to come to moral conclusions. The first reductio is organ harvesting, a classic. A number of important people, for example doctors, philosophers, economists, suddenly find themselves in a situation where they need immediate organ transplants in order to survive a given accident. Unfortunately, the hospital has none of the required organs available. However, the surgeon is aware of a lonely, unemployed individual with compatible set of organs which may be harvested to provide for the important people. If it is conditionally the case that net utility would be greater if the individual is killed for his organs and the important people can survive and go on to do great things for the world, the utilitarian must acknowledge that this is the moral thing to do, and, more importantly, not doing it would be immoral. However, in the real world, of course, it is unknown if it is true if the procedure will maximise net utility, and therefore the utilitarian can fall back on intuition, that biting a bullet that will in fact decrease utility, because maybe many people will be unhappy about the fact an innocent would have been killed for the greater good. However, another utilitarian could intuit that people adapt to new social habits all the time, no matter how brutal they may be, and therefore the procedure may not decrease utility this way. Without the ability to clearly and objectively calculate net utility, the question remains unanswerable, and utilitarians rely on how they feel to warp the ethic in their favour. Second hypothetical, the utility monster. Suppose there exists a fictional beast who derives such an intense amount of pleasure from harming other people. Any harm he causes is outweighed by his own pleasure, and thus utility is maximised by allowing the monster to run riot. Again, if it is conditionally true that this is the case, the utilitarian must give the monster's actions their stamp of approval. The only way around this is to deny the monster's pleasure can possibly maximise net utility through intuition, but of course, two people can intuit differently, and with no means of calculation, this question has no utilitarian answer once again. Third hypothetical, unpopular versus popular sports teams. Imagine for two football teams are playing in a cup final. One team has many times the number of fans as the other. Popular FC have a last-minute penalty which, if scored, all but guarantees that they win the match, much to the pleasure of their million-strong fan base. This means that Unpopular FC's goalkeeper has a dilemma on his hands. If he saves the penalty, his team might go on to beat Popular FC and disappoint their fans. If he dives the wrong way, he'll maximise net utility and more fans than not will be celebrating into the night. How could a utilitarian argue against his decision to dive the wrong way? You could say that in general it is utility maximising for both teams to try and win the match, otherwise football would be a boring sport, but this leads us only to an ethic where unpopular teams push popular teams far enough to make the sport more entertaining. But at the end of the day, it is still utility maximising for the more popular teams to come out on top. Again, the utilitarian is forced to intuit their way out of the problem, and thus the question remains once again unanswered for the same previous reasons. Upon being given these reductios, the utilitarian may be right to assert that any ethical framework is subject to reductio ad absurdums which lead to unintuitive answers, and then they'll make the claim that other ethical frameworks are subject to biting worse bullets than utilitarianism is. Well, let's test this and compare it to egoism, which is the philosophy of this channel. The reductios given to utilitarians tend to follow a basic formula. Party A harms Party B in a conventionally unacceptable way, yet which maximises net utility as the pleasure derived by Party A outweighs the harm done to Party B, therefore Party A is right to harm Party B. The reductio given to the egoist follows a formula that Party A harms Party B in a conventionally unacceptable way, yet which maximises utility of Party A alone, regardless of net utility between parties A and B, therefore Party A is right to harm Party B. Assuming the utility maximisation of both examples are conditionally true, the utilitarian concludes that egoism is less intuitive than utilitarianism. However, an important part of the egoist answer is left out here. Egoism is not an objective or impartial moral framework like utilitarianism claims to be, and considers the moral outcome relative to a given subject. In the utilitarian reductio, it is immoral for Party B to resist any harm done to them by Party A in their attempt to maximise net utility. Egoism, however, makes no such claim about Party B. For the egoist, Party B is always right to resist harm done to them by Party A, regardless of the utility to A or the net utility between A and B. In all of the previous reductios, assuming utility maximization is conditionally true in both ways, it is still right for the unemployed individual to avoid having his organs harvested. It is right for the victims to resist the utility monster, and it's right for unpopular FC to try and beat popular FC. As for egoist onlookers, they can decide for themselves if they want to live in a society which allows organ harvesting, utility monsters having their way, or football teams feeling a moral obligation to throw away their chances of beating a more popular team. Egoism has yet another advantage over utilitarianism, which takes us back to utility being a necessarily private experience. I alone know how satisfied I am by a particular outcome, and I alone have full access to understanding my ordinal value hierarchy. You and I do not behave as a collective consciousness, and humanity is not a hive mind. Our experiences are separate, and so we act as separate beings with separate and unique value hierarchies. The collective good is not necessarily my good, and therefore it is not necessarily desirable for me to augment it. Only my happiness is necessarily desirable to me, and only yours is necessarily desirable to you. In the essay on utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill argues that happiness produced is the sole measure of the morality of an action, and that virtue is only reduced to being a means to an end, the end being the augmentation of happiness. This view is passed down by Epicureanism. For the purposes of this video, I'll keep my reasons for preferring virtue in brief. It may be true that my happiness is necessarily desirable to me, and therefore being happy is a preferred mental state towards which my actions are geared. However, I cannot use my happiness as a measure of the rightness or wrongness of my behaviour, as happiness is a fleeting emotion outside of my control. I cannot flip a switch on any given day and decide that I shall experience X amount of happiness. It is a nonsense to suggest that I'm being immoral for not doing that which I have no control over, as morality itself implies the capacity to choose my actions. I can only choose whether or not I act in a way which tends towards my personal happiness, and we refer to such actions as virtues. I can choose to be honest, hard-working, caring, respectful, temperate, etc., and therefore the morality of my actions can be judged according to their correspondence with virtue. To summarise, utility is a necessarily private experience, and therefore we have no means of calculating net utility in consequence of a given action. We can only intuit our way around utilitarian answers, which leads to unsolvable disputes between utilitarians in a range of scenarios, and ethic warping to avoid undesirable conclusions from a consistent application of the ethic. Even accepting the argument from intuition, and given the conditional truth of utility maximization, utilitarianism does not lead to more acceptable, intuitive answers to reductios than egoism does, given that the egoist will never assert that a victim of harm is wrong to resist harm done to them under any circumstances, but the utilitarian will condemn any resistance against a greater good. Humans are not a hive mind, and we only have access to our own means of maximising utility for ourselves. Egoism, therefore, does not suffer the same epistemic problems of utilitarianism when one attempts to apply the ethic. Acting virtuously is in our control, and maximising happiness is not. Therefore, moral judgments made about actions can only be made with reference to their correspondence with virtue, and not in correspondence with achieving maximum utility, as moral judgments presuppose choice and control. It is for these reasons I hold that I'm an egoist and not a utilitarian. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.
So it turns out that despite everything I've just said, net utility is calculable. Because watch, if I had one util, and then I added another util, I'll get 2 utils. So right off the bat, we've calculated net utility there. So the utilitarians are right. I can even do multiplication, look. Because if I take those 2 utils and I times them by 2, I should get, 4 utils. Utility is calculable.